I thank you very much for the invitation to this, for the honorable invitation to this workshop. And I was asked to tell you something about the very vivid, the very vivid discussion or debate in animal ethics we have about since the 1970s from in the Western philosophical debate and also in the Christian theological thinking. And therefore, does it work? Mm-hmm. What's going on with technique? Okay, now it works. Sorry. So I just want to introduce you to that I stress especially the justification strategies. Being hunted by predators are a vital common experience of humans and animals since the origin of living beings. But it is only the human being who starts to reflect upon the ambivalences of the human-animal relationship and her own practice with regard to good and evil. It seems that the first hints for this kind of reflection can be found in prehistoric animal sculptures and cave drawings. Mythologies and legends are the first written proofs of thinking about the human-animal relationship, and I want to go with you to have a look at some mythological pieces in the biblical thinking. The beginning of Western thinking derives from the productive exchange of Near Eastern and of Old Greek traditions during the Hellenistic period, when Oriental and Occidental cultures met. I will ask how motives and justification strategies have been transferred to our modern discussion. The justification strategies with regard to the human-animal relation are twofold, at least. One underlines the differences and argues for excluding animals from the human moral community. The other strategy underlines the commonalities between humans and animals. This demonstrates that the human-animal debate inevitably implies anthropological conceptions about human identity. The challenge in modern animal ethics is to combine the truth about the variety of empirical similarities between human beings and non-human animals, both in plural here, with the truth of the essential ethical difference between the human being and the animal, both in singular now, namely that we take only the human being for morally accountable and able to reflect about moral justification. So please keep in mind that subsequently I will not tell anything about the real practices, how animals have been used by the peoples during the different periods. I will not deal with hunting, slaughtering, or animal sacrificing and so on in reality. I will only speak about the justifying arguments which people used to show why animals should matter religiously and morally or not. So we make the first step into the biblical thinking. The first biblical chapters about the divine creation of the world have been highly influential upon the Christian anthropological thinking. Here, the human being is determined to be the creature that has a special relationship to the Creator, namely to be his accountable representative in the world. whereas the Assyrian and Egyptian neighbors regarded only the king as the representative of God, determined to rule the people. The Israelitic version presents all human beings, male and female, as his true representatives in the world, and contrasts the universal humane kingship to the animals as determined to be ruled by the human being. You see here, I have made a model from the Egyptian pharaoh, who only is the representative of God, to rule over mankind, to rule over especially the Egyptian people. And on this background, the Israelites transferred it or universalized the position of to be a representative. What is it here? That, no. Sorry, where's the pointer? The pointer is here, yeah? That's the pointer. You see that not only the Pharaoh is the representative of God in the first chapter of the Bible, but all human beings, namely female and male humans. And they do not have to rule over other human beings. So we have also an ideological critique of might, but they have to rule about the animals and the earth. However, the mythology about the creation intends to tell about a perfect beginning of the world. Thus, shedding blood cannot be part of the divine original order of the world, which is therefore characterized by a vegetarian diet, diet law for humans and animals. You find here in these verses of the first chapter. God said, "See, I give you everything seed-bearing plant all over the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit on it to be your food. And to all the animals of the land, all the birds of the air, and all the living creatures that crawl on the ground, I give all the green plants for food." Meat eating is only allowed after the big flood, when the Creator arranged a second best order. You see here, every creature that is alive shall be yours to eat. I give them all to you as I did the green plants. Only a flesh with the live blood still in it you shall not eat. So that is the second best order that tells us about reality. Regarding the post-diluvial era, the realistic insight is taken into account that the evil will always be part of the world. Although meat eating has become allowed, it is restricted by the law that the human being shall not enjoy the animal's blood. Blood was regarded as the carrier of the spirit of life. Therefore, the blood of slaughtered animals should be restored to the Creator as the master of life. Refraining from enjoying animal blood, a precept which is still vivid in Jewish and Muslim religious diet rules, can be understood as an expression of abstaining from subduing animals totally. Violence and bloodshed does not fit with the imagination of a perfect divine world order. This message is told not only by the myth about the original creation in the first chapter, but also in the visions of the new creation in the eschatological perspective, in the perspective of the hope of the new creation, for example, in the text of a prophet called Deutero-Isaiah. Here we find the metaphor of animal peace, which includes, besides the perfect harmony between cattle and predator animals, a peaceful relationship between animals and humans too. Moreover, the verses reflect a sublime critique of might as a root of violence at all, when presenting a total change of natural and societal roles that intends not to overcome the enemy, but the inimical relations. So the sheep offers hosting to the wolf. Children, instead of grown-up shepherds, survey calves and lions together. The lion changed to vegetarian diet like an ox, and babies play near the role of poisoned serpents. Obviously, these are no descriptions of real-life experiences, but poetic sense about human hopes and longings for safety, trust, and the total absence of violence that will regrettably be never true in real life. A modern interpretation characterizes these creational and eschatological myths as messages from a past which we hope for and from a future we remember. These exchanges of time dimensions indicate the irreality or the utopian character of the depicted situations. They can be understood as wishful value orientations in which it is a matter of course that animals have been included as co-creatures to the old Israelites. In other words, the consciousness of being addressed as the Creator's accountable and elected representative did not imply to exclude non-human creatures from the hope on divine salvation, which is foreshadowed in a variety of restrictions and prescriptions concerning the use of animals in the legal texts of the Bible, e.g., the inclusion of the cattle and the prohibition to work on the Shabbat, the prohibition to muzzle an ox when it is treading out grain, the prohibition to take the mother bird with her brood, and so on. The proverb 12:10 shows the just man takes care of his beast, but the heart of the wicked is merciless. This verse has become a leading motive in the early animal protection movement in the 19th century in the Western region. It presupposes that the piety of the tzaddik in Hebrew, the just man in the eye of God, does not only concern his relationship to God, but affects his behavior in terms of a merciful attitude to human beings and even to his cattle. That is the religious duty of a tzaddik, since it is evident that the Lord sustains humans and beasts, like Psalm 36, the 7th verse, is telling us. So let us go to the role of the reason in Greek philosophy and the big changes which are introduced to that. This obviously non-egalitarian intellectual inclusion of animals has changed fundamentally in the period of Greek and Hellenistic philosophy. The reason for this change is the high evaluation of reason as a faculty or a property which only the human soul possesses. Reason became the anthropologic characteristic that distinguished sharply between human and the non-human living beings, whereas the biblical characterization of the human being as the Creator's representative consisted in the claim of responsibility, the Greek concept of the human being is based on reason as a natural ability of the species-specific human soul. So the biblical special moral relationship between God and the human being has been transferred into an ontological property of the human being. It is a process of ontologicalization. This kind of cultural transfer can be studied in a Hellenistic biblical reflection upon Genesis 1:26. We find in the biblical book of Wisdom, in the 2nd chapter, verse 23. For God formed man to be imperishable, the image of his own nature he made him. You see that the original verse is about the 6th century before Christ, and here we have a Hellenistic reflection from about 150 before Christ. Based on this kind of ontologicalization of reason as a species-specific soul ability of the human being, the classical Greek philosophers followed an exclusive logic of equality. They concluded that moral, legal, and religious communities could only consist of members who were naturally determined to be rational moral agents, that what we later call persons. Non-rational beings have been excluded from the possibility becoming a member of moral communities or being addressed by moral concern. Here is a selection of quotations that shows a powerful philosophical excluding argumentation strategy that influences the Western animal ethical debate until today. For example, here, Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek authors and poets, in a mythological poem about works and days, he admonished his brother Perseus to follow the natural law by refraining from violence, since the Greek highest god, Zeus, has gifted the humans with the sense of justice, whereas fish, wild beasts, and birds shall swallow one another, since there is no law among them. Hesiod is the first European thinker who distinguishes between humans and animals with regard to the sense of justice. Animals are excluded from the community of natural law. An echo of this position we can find by the Hellenistic philosopher Epicure, who has maintained, for all living beings unable to make contracts in order to prevent mutual harm, there is no justice or injustice. Epicure's basic intellectual credo is an influential source for contract theories from Francis Bacon to John Rawls and beyond. Aristotle, the most famous pupil of Plato, excluded animals from friendship communities and from the possibility to be happy due to their lack of reason. No friendship is possible to the non-living entities, and also no relationship of injustice. However, that is true also for the relation to a horse or to an ox, because it is of common knowledge that there is a sort of just relationship for every human being to any other being that can participate in law and contractual convention. Therefore, friendship is imaginable so far the being is human. You can find this kind of utterance also, for example, in the Catholic catechism, in the modern world catechism of the Catholic Church. And here we see that Aristotle excludes the animals from happiness, from eudaimonia, while for the gods, the whole life is a state of happiness, and for the human beings too, so far they may reflect at least a little of the splendor of the illustrious divine activity, the other living beings can never be happy, since they are not able to participate in intellectual contemplation. So, dear audience, please notice that you are now in the highest state of happiness because you are doing intellectual work, according to Aristotle. The medieval theologians, theologian Thomas Aquinas is famous. I just noticed here that there is no reason, therefore we have no happiness, and for religious thinking it is relevant that there is no relation to the divine possible. So Thomas Aquinas is famous because of the adoption of the Aristotle's philosophy in Christian theology. Aquinas concluded from the philosopher's statement that also the Creator would not have a friendship relation to his non-rational creature, and that animals would lack an own good and were only created for the good of the human being. Strictly spoken, one cannot wish something good for a non-rational creature, since it is not its affair to possess an own good, because having a good that presupposes that you are able to reason. From these quotations, we can easily see that the animals, because of their lack of reason, were totally instrumentalized for the human purposes. Aquinas denies that they could have a good for themselves. Please remember that for the biblical positions, it has been evident that the Creator sustains humans as well as animals, because both need his loving support, what in Christian theology we call creatio continua, the continuous creation, or the continuous activity of the Creator for his creatures. This remarkable shift was possible because under the philosophical influence since the Hellenistic period, the theologians changed the biblical idea of a loving and emotionally engaged creator and replaced it by the philosophical intellectual idea of God as pure reason. On this background, reason becomes a precondition for having a relationship to God as the highest reasonable good. So we have a change in the image of God, in the representation of God. In consequence, non-reasonable animals were dropped out from the perspective for salvation. This declaration has already been made in the Platonic tradition by virtue of the argument of the imperishable soul. In the dialogue Phaedon, Platon proved the imperishability of the human soul by the non-ending activity of the capacity of reasoning. We have already encountered the argument's effect in the reinterpretation of Genesis 1:26 in Wisdom 2:23. So there is a bundle of philosophical arguments that show that the individual animal has no reason for having a hope on salvation, resurrection, or the loving nearness to the Creator. Animal ethicists have drawn the cynical conclusion that nowhere the extermination of species have been as extraordinary as in the Christian heaven. It is only since the beginnings of the Western animal protection movement that Christian theologians started rethinking a theology of creation and salvation that includes all beloved creatures, and not only the so-called reasonable human ones. Nevertheless, Aquinas has gone far beyond Aristotle's already traditional anthropocentrism that has been radicalized in the Stoic philosophy. In the following quotation from the Christian church father Augustine, who lived during the last period of the Roman Empire, we can learn the ill-famed Stoic anthropocentrism in the shape of its Christian adoption. We can perceive by their cries that animals die with pain, although we make little of this, since the beast, lacking a rational soul, is not related to us by a common nature, so we do not share with them a community of rights. So here we see that reason is a precondition to be acknowledged as a member in the Stoic natural rights community. Reason is a kind of entrance ticket to the moral community. It is interesting that the Stoic philosophers invented the instinct theory for non-rational animals in the context of their doctrine about providential acting of God, the pronoia or eikeosis doctrine, or the doctrine of providentia. In the Stoic oikeiosis doctrine, the personal care of the biblical creator for every living individual is replaced through the instinct as an inner natural law that works providentially in every living individual. For example, in caring for itself, or also in the procreation, in the generation, in the sustaining of the species. But there is no more need for a personal, individual engagement of God to the animals. Yeah, it is depersonalized. From the old Stoic philosopher Chrysipp, a thorough anthropocentrist of the old Stoic school, it is said that he has praised the divine providence for delivering a living soul to non-rational animals, like pigs, for example, for it would work like salt that prevents their meat from fast rotting. So, let's step into the modern philosophy, as the starting point in the 16th century. Here we will deal with Descartes' beast machine theory. This has been, what I already told you until now, has been the dominant philosophical and Catholic theological background on which René Descartes has developed his beast machine theory. According to this theory, animals do not only lack reason, but even a soul with sensitive capacities. This can be understood when realizing that Descartes criticized Aristotle's teleological natural philosophy. I have to build up this. And Aristotle's quasi-biological concept of a soul. What perhaps is not so common or not so quaint is that Aristotle is not only an ethicist, but he has written a lot of ancient biological writings about, especially about animals. And his pupil Theophrast has been the great botanist in antiquity. That is not so common. So Aristotle's soul is a quasi-biological principle with which Aristotle wanted to explain why, while things with a soul that are plants, animals, and also the human beings do move from their self. Yeah, they nourish. They are becoming bigger. They are growing, and they are sustaining their species, and so. That is distinguished by the inorganic things like minerals, like stones or so. They do not do these things for themselves. And the explaining principle for Aristotle was these living beings are able to do this because they are moved by a soul. So a soul is a quasi-biological principle for Aristotle to distinguish between the inorganic, the things without a soul, and the things with a soul, moved by a soul, and that they can move for themselves. Descartes now determined the soul not to be a principle to explain why living things are alive and are moving by themselves. But for Descartes now, the soul is just a principle of self-consciousness. So that is very, very important for the change in modern philosophy. So Descartes determined the notion of soul as being a principle of self-consciousness, his famous cogito ergo sum, and introduced himself with this as the father of modern philosophy. For Descartes, sensations are necessarily connected to the self-consciousness to become conscious representations in the mind. Thus, the animal ethical implications of Descartes' modern philosophy of mind is that animals were even doubted to be sentient beings. That is now a very important change in the modern times. So, where an important boundary for Aristotle is between the inorganic and the organic. Now for Descartes, the important boundary is between self-consciousness and the other, what is becoming like a machine. In his famous Discours de la méthode, he argues as follows. First, since the time of the Stoic philosophy, reasonable speech is regarded to be the outer sign for the inner reason. Animals cannot talk reasonably. That proves that they do not possess any reason at all. Second, since ancient times, defenders of animal reason argued that some animals are more skillful in certain activities than humans can ever be. For example, like bees who make these wonderful mathematical correct hexagonal waves, for example. But all animals are unable to learn other activities or to learn everything. That shows that they lack reason, for reason is the universal capacity of the soul that enables to learn everything. Instead, the special skillful activities of animals are nothing else than the precise functions of the organs of a machine. This becomes evident by comparing the human being with a mechanical clock, which is also more precise and skillful in counting hours than humans are. So we have the argument of speech as the outer sign for inner reason, mind, or soul. But Descartes proves there is no speech, no reason, no mind, no soul. The animal is just like a mechanical clock, and the living beings are the wonderful engineering products of the great engineer, the great divine engineer. So you see here the models, the engineering models of animals. They were very famous in the 17th century. So with Descartes, you can do a lot of mathematics and physics, but you cannot do anything in the biological area with the Cartesian philosophy. It is close at hand that Descartes' beast machine theory has been a very useful justification strategy for animal experimentation, even with theological implications. The French philosopher and Cartesian Darmanson explicated how the Cartesian theory may serve to solve a theodicy problem. When facing all the painful activities humans do with animals, then the creator would be blamed being cruel if he would have created animals with the ability to feel and to suffer. But the Cartesian beast machine theory helps to justify God despite the cruel activities of the human being. Nevertheless, Descartes' denial of animal suffering provoked a vivid philosophical and theological debate about the animal soul and animal experimentation in the 17th and 18th century. It found ideological support by the psychological approach of behaviorism that refrained from dealing with the inner experience of living beings in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Animal psychologists and animal protectionists have struggled for the acknowledgement of animal awareness and their capacity to feel and to suffer against neo-Cartesians and behaviorists until the middle of the 20th century. So I think it is interesting always to be aware what is the background the animal protection movement is discussing against. Yeah, therefore it is important to remember this. So we are stepping to the present times, the pathocentric approach and the discussion about the boundary of sentience. Jeremy Bentham's famous remark, "The question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer?" Now you easily can recognize that this notion of the footnote in the second edition of the Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation from 1823 questions evidently the Cartesian position. It became programmatic, and the new animal rights movement as a pathocentric approach, especially promoted by the utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer in his writings Animal Liberation and Practical Ethics. However, already before his highly influential publications, Singer has taken up the aspect of equality as the leading ethical principle in a review of an English edited book about animal protection. That has been the very starting point for the new animal ethical debate, or animal ethical debate. And Singer has reviewed it in the New York Review of Books. And in this book, you can find also the first publication of the animal psychologist Richard Ryder, who has become famous because of the notion of speciesism. He worked also in animal experimentation laboratories. The heading of Singer's book review contains the leading philosophical message, all animals are equal. And he has also a very nice humor. So this principle is taken from Orwell's Animal Farm. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It is remarkable that the pathocentric philosopher follows the same program like the dominant intellectualistic tradition in philosophy, which I have shown you, which has included animals from moral consideration, equality. But they differ in the property that shall constitute the community of the equals now. The excluding party has chosen the feature of reason as the ticket to enter the moral community. The pathocentrists choose sentience, or respectively the capacity of suffering and enjoyment, as a famous quotation from Singer shows. If a being is not able of suffering or of experiencing enjoyment or happiness, there is nothing to be taken into account. This is why the limit of sentience is the only defensible boundary of concern for the interests of others. Defining this boundary by other features like intelligence or rationality would mean to define it arbitrarily. So what can we learn about these justification strategies? I'm coming to the end. These alternative suggestions put the question on the table, what kind of role the different features... I'll take first this one. What kind of role the different features like reason or sentience may play in the ethical argumentation, and whether the supposition is correct that equality is the only possible guiding principle in moral communities. The first counter-argument against the sentience party is that sentience or other capacities like enjoyment or suffering are nothing else than empirical features. from which ethical prescriptions or evaluations cannot be derived. This is called Hume's verdict of an is-ought or of an fact-value fallacy. But isn't that true for reason too? Taken as an empirical feature, like the philosophical tradition did, we would have to admit. But taken as the logical presupposition for the possibility of moral accountability, makes reason the decisive condition for the constitution of moral agency and reflection at all. When reason is conceived this way, it is no longer an empirical or ontological feature or property, but a moral reflective self-relationship that makes us becoming aware about being moral agents. And now I will show you in a comparison between my model of Genesis 1 and the secular variant in Immanuel Kant, how you now can recognize that practical reason or moral reason is a kind of relationship here between the humans and God, and here a relationship of responsibility of ourself, for example, to our moral consciousness. But you cannot measure it empirically. There is no machine that can detect moral responsibility. But why should moral agents take only equals, namely other moral agents, into their moral account, as the classical anthropocentrists from Hesiod to the Cartesian maintained? Instead, we can argue for animal protection that moral agents are able to take moral responsibility for beings which are no moral agents at all. So the moral community do not exist only of equals, but also of unequals, of different entities. In this case, empirical features like sentience or living may inform moral agents that they should take into consideration when thinking, or what they should take into consideration when thinking about how the being should be treated adequately. Not if, but how. That is the change. As a result, we can say that reason, on the one hand, is the necessary condition for the possibility of moral agency, in principle, and that ontological features and empirical capabilities inform moral agents how entities should be handled adequately in concrete situations. That is moral justification, or what we have to do. Thus, moral communities usually consist of different members, namely moral agents and moral patients, like, for example, Tom Regan has named it, and not only of equals. One of the first philosophers who have conceived the more complex structure of moral reason and moral communities has been Immanuel Kant, the big philosopher of the Enlightenment. In his analysis of duty relationships, he re-included morally incompetent entities like minerals, plants, and animals as vulnerable entities which should be regarded by moral agents. Retranslating Kant's secular duty analysis into theological concepts, we can say that moral accountability towards God, or the moral self, gives the human creature a special position in the creation. But vulnerability in different kinds is the common characteristic of all creatures, humans and non-humans, and gives rise for moral agents to take responsibility for vulnerable creatures. But there is not only a secular possibility in Kant, but also the religious dimension is possible to integrate, but in another position. I have tried to show it to you in this model. It is interesting to realize that Immanuel Kant has been educated as a Protestant Christian. Martin Luther, the first reformer, the founder of the Protestantism, has changed the theological anthropology. He has criticized the Catholic triumphalistic anthropology of the human being as a king in the creation, or to have the metaphor, the Platonic metaphor, the image of God. Yeah. He changed it into the human being as a sinner. This anthropological shift paved the way to remember the old Hebrew anthropology of the human being as the accountable steward who is responsible towards the Creator for a merciful handling of the creatures. Because it was the mankind as the sinner in the original sin who brought suffering into the very good creation. I'm just finished. The so-called stewardship anthropology, yeah, you can you can find it here. That is the stewardship anthropological interpretation, stimulated the emergence of Protestant movements of the protection of animals and nature since the 17th century until modern days. So I have drawn the line of the main ethical justification strategies, at least the most important one, for the inclusion or exclusion of the moral consideration of animals. I refrained from telling other poetic stories about spiritual contemplations of non-human creatures as vestiges of the Creator and so on, because I wanted to underline the ethical side of the human-animal relationship, which determines our debates until today. Thank you very much for your attention.